Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 75 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on a large room in an old house in North London. It is 1965, and the house is lived in by a father, two of his three grown-up sons, and his brother. This all-male household is a fractious one, their combative instincts unchecked without the ameliorating influence of a mother. But their long-established routines and rivalries are about to be dramatically disrupted by the unannounced arrival of the third son, who has been living in America and not been back for some years. He brings with him his wife, a woman the family did not know existed, and whose provocative presence will bring unexpected changes to all of their lives. This is the opening of Harold Pinter's disturbing exploration of toxic masculinity and sexual maneuvering, The Homecoming. The play premiered in June 1965 at the Aldwych Theatre in London in an RSC production directed by Peter Hall, before a run on Broadway in 1967, where it won the Tony Award for Best Play. In 1973, Peter Hall also directed a film of the play with largely the original RSC cast and the screenplay by Pinter. As we record this episode, a new production of The Homecoming is currently playing at the Young Vic Theatre in London, directed by Matthew Dunster. The play's portrait of misogyny, and even more disturbing, the apparent female complicity, was shocking at the time it was written. Nearly 60 years on, the sexual politics is, if anything, even more difficult to watch. So what was Pinter's purpose in presenting such a provocative piece? And how do we process it in the post-Me Too age? Well, happily, I'm joined by someone who can help us answer those questions. None other than the director of the current production, Matthew Dunster. Matthew is a director, actor, and playwright who over the past 15 years has directed more than 50 plays, including productions at the RSC, the Royal Exchange in Manchester, Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, and the Globe Theatre, where he was associate director from 2015 to 2017. He's had a special relationship with Martin McDonagh, having directed 3 of his plays, including A Very, Very, Very Dark Matter, Hangman at both the Royal Court and on Broadway, and most recently, The Pillowman in the West End, which incidentally was the subject of episode 66 of our podcast. Matthew is also responsible for 2 of the West End's recent hits, 222, A Ghost Story, and Shirley Valentine, starring Sheridan Smith. So, welcome to the Play Podcast, Matthew. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So, I'm going to go straight to the heart to start. As I said just now, this is not an easy play to watch. It wasn't when it was written, and I hazard to suggest that many will find it even more objectionable today. So, why did you believe it was worth reviving, and what do you say to those who are outraged by it?
Well, that's a big question.
I know.
If I start with the latter half of your question first, I guess I don't experience much of the outrage because who's going to tell me? And also, I don't tend to read the reviews, so I'm not clued into a lot of that. And part of that is because I don't want to ever censor decisions that I make, whether that's about choosing the plays that are direct or while I'm making the work. I want to make it on my terms and try and realize the play as I see it and not try and second guess people's objections or fears or censorious natures. So, look, I'm a big Pinter fan, and I realized one could very easily get to the end of one's career and never have directed a Pinter play. So I guess I was emboldened in the first instance that I was invited to direct this play by Kwame Kwei-Armah. And I just thought, if this black man who runs a particular kind of theatre with a particular kind of important political agenda thinks this play is worthy of interrogation, then I felt emboldened by that. And I guess the other thing is there are things that plays are about, and there are ways that plays have been constructed. And I think that the construction of the play is genius and trailblazing. And it's interesting you mentioned Martin McDonough. He's a friend of mine, as you said. He was there at press night, as was another very good friend of mine, Dennis Kelly. And actually, I think they're aware they would never have written a word if this play didn't exist.
Yeah.
And I think that all the structural symbolist risks that he takes within a seemingly naturalistic setting are so powerful, so important to us as playwrights and theatre makers. And I also think people have a right to be outraged, and I have a right to outrage people, and Pinter's got a right to outrage people, and that's a really healthy and worthy response. I did a little after show discussion about the play yesterday with some donors who very generously donate to the Young Vic, the majority of whom were female, and some of them, they said there were elements of it that they were disgusted by, but they were thrilled to be given the opportunity to experience disgust.
That's fascinating, because I was actually going to ask you about the different responses potentially from men and women. There's so much in what you've just said. I was interested, for example, in the distinguishing between what the play is about and the way it's made. One can't but have admiration for what Pinter does structurally and form with language. And of course, just the daringness of it at all. And I read that you'd said recently somewhere that we should be able to say anything on our stages. So
I think so.
we can't but agree about your instinct about not being censored. And of course, as we will discuss, what he is saying is pretty complicated.
It's very complicated. And, I'm sure there is a sort of genderized difference in response to the play. There's also, because of the way we do the play and the thrust, there's a lot of light on the audience. The actors have observed or felt that actually younger women are responding and engaging with the play in a very different way to women of an older generation. And that the younger audience members are more visibly angered or shocked by the nature of the behavior of the men.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. And another thing that I always feel about plays is if we don't do the difficult ones, if we don't do plays about misogynistic characters, we trick ourselves into thinking that we've solved those problems, and we haven't solved those problems.
You can't pretend it doesn't exist.
Can't pretend it doesn't exist. I guess if we're talking about gender, it's very important to talk about the actress who plays Ruth, Lisa Devaney, but also perhaps all the actresses that we auditioned for that part. And so, of course, we were auditioning intelligent, engaged, creative women who know their own minds and felt Ruth is something important, something that they would like to take on. One of the things that we discussed right at the beginning of the process is I said to all the men involved in the project, whatever Lisa decides is Ruth's journey, we can't be obstacles to that. She's got the most difficult job.
Yeah.
She's going to have a take on who this woman is. And we need to make sure that we allow her to go on that journey. And everybody embraced that. And we did a hell of a lot of talk about the background of that woman and that character and why we might see her in the situation that we do in the period where the play takes place, the 48 hours where the play takes place, and the decisions she takes and the deals she makes within the body of the play.
Yeah, and those are, I suppose, some of the most difficult aspects to reconcile. It's fascinating what you're saying about the younger women, including those who auditioned or were interested in the part. And I was going to say that in terms of the gender difference, that I don't know whether this was just that day, but it seemed to me that at the curtain call, it was mostly men on their feet. And I have actually had a couple of people who have been, as you say, disgusted. But let's wind it back a bit first, Matthew, to where that comes from in Pinter's career as a writer in his life. I don't know how much background you did on this, but you perhaps already know all this stuff about where does the homecoming come in Pinter's writing life?
I only kind of know this colloquially and as a fan, not as a sort of academic.
Yeah.
But I think what's really interesting about it is if I was to ask you what Pinter's plays are, the major plays, you could probably count on one hand. And by that, I guess I mean full-length plays that are revisited often. The Birthday Party, The Caretaker, The Homecoming, Old Times, No Man's Land,
Betrayal.
Betrayal, of course, yes. And what's really interesting is I think the birthday party was 1958. And then the next hit was The Caretaker. And then quite close to that was The Dumbwaiter. But of course, The Dumbwaiter is a one-act play. And all those plays in between The Caretaker, which I think was about 1960, and then this play, which is 1965, they were written for television or radio. So he wasn't a major playwright until The Homecoming. The Homecoming opened in the West End at the Old Witch, and it really sort of cemented him as a kind of major English voice with the support of Peter Hall and the RSC. It's very interesting to look at the landscape of new writing then, that it's actually very similar now. It takes a great deal of dedication for writers to continue to work in the theatre.
Yeah.
Because the pull of television is so strong. And it's actually interesting to see that that was where he had to learn his craft. It's not easy for writers to get plays on in the theatre, and it never has been.
And also extraordinary is to do a play like this in the West End. I think Peter Hall had to fight pretty hard, didn't he, to put it on?
I think he lost that fight. The story is that the RSC, everybody else who made those decisions with him, said, it's not a commercial play, it's a strange play, it's too experimental. And he said, yeah, I hear all that, but I'm doing it anyway.
Great.
Again, in terms of the landscape, it's worth remembering that when he wrote this play, he was in his mid-30s. He was still a young writer who needed support. People need allies. And I think all those other plays, shorter plays, around that time, off the top of my head, things like Silence and The Lover and The Collection, they were written either for radio or television. And later, and I'm sure he had an eye on this, because they moved so easily and readily to the theatre. But often the first performances were television or radio. And I think then the next major play was No Man's Land in about 1970. So he's only writing these kind of 2 or 3 act plays once every 5 years. And I think what's important about that is that's why they move so far. That's why formally there's such a big difference each time he returns to one of these major plays. And The Homecoming, it's worth saying, I think, there's some interviews where he's asked what his favourite play is. And I don't know if he would ever be so crude as to say The Homecoming was his favourite play, but he said it's the one that gives him the most satisfaction. And I've heard that from Patrick Marber, who worked with him a few times, but you can also see interviews.
So why do you think he said that?
Well, this is what he said. He said, and I'll do a bad impersonation of him, The Homecoming, 2 movements. And he lifts his hand and he shoves his hand down. Boy, did that help me understand the play.
That's fascinating.
There's a kind of setup in Act 1 that could be deemed to be almost wholly naturalistic. Some strange speeches in there, but you're not asked to accept the level of symbolism and the level of shocking content that you're asked to take on in that second act. So I think perhaps he's talking about a little bit of a trick, a little bit of sleight of hand, that you think you're getting one play, and actually another one is delivered to you very boldly in the second half.
That's fascinating. There's, again, so much in that about where the play itself comes from as well. I read that he wrote it in 6 weeks in 1964, 65, when he was living down in Worthing, where he bought a rather grand Regency house, presumably with the monies he'd earned following The Caretaker's success and from TV writing, as you say. It's intriguing to think of him being there in these relatively gracious surroundings in Worthing in this house and writing about these thuggish characters in London, perhaps thinking back to his less salubrious East End roots, I guess, in some way.
Yeah, it's on record. There's a lot of detail about this in Billington's biography, that he had a friend whose upbringing was very similar to his. They were both young, bright Jewish boys in the East End, both went to grammar schools. His friend became an academic and moved to Canada and married a Gentile and kept all this secret from his rather tyrannical father. And when they were looking for locations for the film, I think Pinter took Peter Hall to meet this father. So there is a kind of narrative strand that is based on his own experience. I think he had some tough relations. He certainly enjoyed the company of his cousins who were boxers. And of course, boxing was very much a pastime of the working class in the 1960s.
And he also, of course, he married Vivian Merchant, who was also a Gentile. I don't know whether there was an issue in his family or not, but there was a precedent in this friend's family anyway.
Yes, there was a precedent in his friend's family. I don't think there was any kind of issue with his own parents. I think he enjoyed a very warm relationship with his parents, as I understand it.
Can I ask you about the process and the form then you touched on, about the realism and the structure of things as well? Because he describes the process he goes through where he starts with characters in a particular context, not with the theme in mind of any kind, and then generally lets the characters and the relationships dictate where they go. While at the same time, I guess he ultimately shapes it and has some idea of structure. Pinter said it kind of wrote itself. And I think you can see that in this series of exchanges between these characters, that kind of evolves that way.
I think so. I mean, it's interesting that when he says it sort of wrote itself, I mean, I think he's doing himself a massive misservice. But
Yeah.
what he does is he lets the characters speak. And some of the speeches, Lenny's speeches, for example, certainly, they're not sort of dramaturgically efficient. So that's not important to him, it seems. What's important to him in those instances is to let those characters fully express themselves. And if the expression is absurdist or hard to grasp, that's okay. The voice is the thing. The character's voice is the thing. It really surprises me that in the first scene between Ruth and Lenny, he has this very long speech where he talks about assaulting a sex worker. And then no writer these days would be allowed to then follow that up with a similarly long story about violence against a woman who's asked him to help her get the mangle into his house. But that's not important to him, clearly, at that point, a kind of dramaturgical efficiency. It's about fully exploring the mind and the voice of this man, Lenny. So he lets the characters speak. He famously starts with an image, and he could see a man and a woman with a suitcase in a room. So immediately that gives you the title, doesn't it? That's the homecoming. So the title obviously landed, whether he was conscious of it or not, with that first image. And that's interesting because that's not the first scene, of course. So there is then some structural stuff that goes on. He goes back and writes a massive scene prior to the first image that came to his head. So he is then structuring the story around those first ideas. He famously doesn't name those characters for a long time. It's A and B and then A, B, C, D. He just starts with letters. Again, it makes me confident then that what they say to begin with is more important than who they are. He doesn't have a name for them. He might not even have a gender for them, but he knows how they speak.
Yeah, and they're creating their character, as you say, by what they're saying, as he's letting them speak. Those stories, as you mentioned, of Lenny are just extraordinary. And you say allowing that to happen, but it's also slightly surreal.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Because you talked about the form where it feels realistic in some form. The setting, looks pretty realistic. And there's an everyday life going on of some kind, but then he just launches into these kind of strange, impressionistic, poetic speeches. And so I was going to ask you about this form. How much is it realism and how much is it stylized, self-consciously artistic creation? And what is the effect of that? Because I also, in your production, there are moments, for example, of cinematic, like freeze frame, where something is very brightly targeted with a spotlight. And it's a kind of moment of memory or crisis or trauma or flashback or something that's not naturalistic. And I wondered whether you were wanting to signal or disrupt this realism, or what is this mix? It seems a pretty uneasy mix at times.
I guess what I felt like was that a lot of the play is crystallized around something physical. So a glass in somebody's hand, a raised walking stick, a bowl of apples. What is that about?
Yeah.
So there's some very symbolic, crystallized, physical moments that he asks you to focus on, which suggests to me that those moments and those objects have great power and great resonance because he's so selective about them. I think the symbolism is about crystallization. I think he takes a potentially very real situation and he says, both in the way the characters speak and in what he asks you to look at within the physical space, only this is important. Everything around it in that moment isn't important. My actors hardly move because the only ones I'm interested in seeing move are the ones that Pinter is asking us to focus on. So there isn't a kind of naturalistic fat of people wandering in and out of the room, moving from chair to chair, all the stuff that you might do with other writers and other productions. I think he's crystallizing, so we should try and follow that. In terms of the lighting, I guess I felt that there were 5 or 6 moments where I wanted to fully acknowledge the violence of the play. But there are also moments, it's hard to explain. I have to go back to Lenny's speeches again. So in Lenny's first speech, he talks about this woman has been looking for him. And clearly she's a sex worker. She makes him some kind of offer. And he said, I turned it down because she was riddled with the pox. And he said that this woman had been essentially brought to him or had been helped to find him by a chauffeur who was a friend of the family. We then hear later in the play that his uncle, who was a chauffeur, used to drive his mother around the West End. What's Pinter suggesting? Is he suggesting that actually the woman that was looking for Lenny was his mother and that their mother is somebody that has been forced by the family to work as a sex worker? It's not specific, but I think what Pinter does very cleverly is he uses the past to shed light on the events that were taking place in front of us. So we try to do something similar with light, that this moment could have occurred in the past. It could have occurred with Jesse. We're asking the audience to gather information from the play in order to help them understand the play as it unfolds in front of them. Because I think it's a very difficult play to understand. I mean, so many people have said to me, Teddy's not really an academic, is he? They're not really married. They've just turned up and it's all an invention. I don't know what it is about my production that is suggesting that, because we absolutely believe he's an academic, but that's the nature of symbolism, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a wonderful moment that achieves what you've just described, the past and the present, when Max, the father, raises his stick, threatening to hit Lenny, his son. And Lenny's speech suggests that he would have done this when they were boys.
Please don't hit me, Daddy. Please don't use a stick on me.
Yes, because that's frozen there, you have that flashback immediately crystallized for you. And therefore, more about the story of their relationship and their past comes out in that one moment.
That's well, good, because that's what we were trying to achieve.
Great. Well, I mean, overall, we talk about this realism and not, and the symbolic elements. There's a strong sense of both. And it creates, I think, a bit like Beckett at times, this sense of dislocation that makes us uneasy. This is partly why the play is uneasy, because we recognize everyday truths in the behavior and the settings and things, and yet then it's not real. And this creates this discomfort, this ambiguity, which is very hard to reconcile. That's my theory anyway. I think we better step back again, Matthew, for listeners who don't know the play and haven't yet had the pleasure of seeing the show. Would you be able to give us an introduction to the characters and a very brief synopsis of what happens in this first and second act of the play? I'm afraid that we can't really talk about the important issues of this play without giving away some spoilers. So if you're planning to go see the show at the Young Vic, you can choose to stop right here and come back to listen after you've been. Otherwise, stay with us.
Well, the play, as you say, takes place in a house in North London. At the beginning of the play, we meet the men that live in that house. Max is the kind of patriarch, and he was formerly a butcher. It now seems that he's retired. His brother, a few years younger than him, Sam, is a chauffeur for a private hire firm. And they have a very fractious relationship. They operate to some extent like a kind of married couple. There's lots of territorial stuff about whose house it is, who should be in the kitchen. And the other two people that live in that house are two of Max's sons, Lenny and Joey. Lenny is a pimp, How successful he is or not, it's hard to decipher. He certainly still lives with his father in a very uncomfortable situation. So we're constantly asked to try and figure out why these four men would live together.
Yeah.
And then the final person is Joey, the youngest son, who is a wannabe boxer. He works on building sites during the day. And it's combative and they don't really listen to each other. And it's a kind of horrible domestic trap that they all seem to be in. And then at the beginning of the second scene, we meet the eldest son who lives in the States, but has just been on a trip to Venice, or so they tell us, with his wife of 6 years, Ruth. The fact that they've been married for 6 years is important because the family don't know about her. And clearly she has had some kind of issues that perhaps the trip to Venice has been intended to solve. I don't want to go so far as to say she's not well. That's, I guess, in the hands of any actor or director that might choose to explore the play.
But probably not happy.
Probably not happy. Then the family, when they meet her, are kind of furious that she's arrived, and they immediately assume that the woman that he's brought into the house must be a whore.
Yeah.
And that's how the first act ends. There's a moment of violence where Max hits Joey, almost to assert his kind of animal, patriarchal, alpha status in front of this woman. And at the beginning of Act 2, it looks like everyone's cleaned up their act, that this female presence has put everybody on their best behavior. They essentially have a lunch made by Max, and Ruth makes coffee for everybody, and it's seemingly quite harmonious until he's reminded by Ruth that one of his past business ventures was a failure. And then Max turns. And from that point, he just wants to destroy everything in front of him. And that affects all the brothers. They all sort of turn on each other. And she is definitely the kind of object and subject of all their gaze and desires. And she's seduced in the first instance by Lenny, and then sort of forcibly sexually assaulted by the younger son, Joey. And yet she seems to take some kind of power from that. Throughout the body of the play, it seems that once Ruth sees what they want, she gives them a little of it in order to then take a great deal more from them. In her absence, in a later scene towards the end of Act 2, they decide that they're going to ask her to stay. And they also decide that what they're going to do is put her, in their words, on the game so that she can pay her own upkeep. What's really strange and hard to understand is why her husband, Teddy, seems to be a kind of complicit bystander.
Yeah. He just lets this unfold and
He lets this unfold
leaves her there.
and leaves her there. Or she makes it unfold and encourages him to go.
Yeah.
You know, so again, how we interpret those actions is different for everybody. Every audience member has a very different response to that. And then the play ends, the husband has left. The stress of the situation has meant that Max's brother Sam has had a heart attack in the middle of the room. And Ruth dares in the final moments to sit in Max's throne in the sort of patriarchal chair. And that position of power seems to make Max, in the final moments of the play, sort of disintegrate. And that's how the play ends, with Max on his knees and with Ruth sat in his throne.
And so, as you say, in some ways, there are two halves to it because of Ruth's reaction and her journey, which is part of the shock of the play. But some of the shock in the early stages, at least, is the toxicity of the masculinity on display in this house. As you said, these four men living together. Why they're together? That's a really great question. Because for all of their talk, it's not that impressive, is it, that these grown men are still living? And it is actually the family home. It belonged to Max and Sam's parents, I believe.
That's correct, yeah.
So they haven't even left that.
Yeah.
But also their talk, their attitudes, their language, their descriptions of encounters with women, it's a pretty relentless misogyny, unfiltered.
Yeah.
And for our time, even more surprising, I suppose. So one of the questions is, where does all that misogyny come from? Why is Pinter showing all of this? I know, of course, it exists, but it's extraordinarily graphic, isn't it?
It is, but I mean, maybe there's a big disconnect between theatre audiences and real people, or theatre critics and real people. I mean, I know these men. I know these men. I'm from a working class community in Oldham, and I go home and I'm constantly shocked by what I hear. I mean, I say I've started to feel that I have to say now because it's important to me to say it so that I can, for want of a better term, recover from it. That I was brought up as a misogynist, a sexist, and a homophobe because of the nature of the community that I was brought up in. And that was in the 70s and the 80s. So, in terms of how Pinter would have heard men behave in that period of time, men that had been brutalized by war, men that were having to adjust to accepting social movements that women were at least trying to make. There's nothing that they say that surprises me. I'm not saying I don't find it abhorrent, but it's nothing I haven't heard men say thousands of times.
It's fascinating when you're saying that. Maybe it's to do with our expectation, but we see on the stage. It's striking still that there are new plays written that are about sections of society, like working class elements of society that don't often get portrayed. It's just as simple as that.
We either want to sentimentalize working class stories like fucking Billy Elliot or romanticize them. I'm afraid it's a lot bleaker than that. These are the people that have created the new blue walls, that voted for Boris Johnson in their droves, working class communities that feel lost and neglected. And that's what we see in Max, isn't it? He feels like a failure. He's furious at the life that has passed him by.
Yes.
He's furious that he wasn't Mac, his best friend, who he sees as a more successful sexual version of himself. He's furious at this younger version of himself, Lenny, who seems to be able to navigate the modern world more successfully than he can.
Yeah, he feels emasculated now, doesn't he? He's frustrated and angry because he's lost whatever hierarchical or territorial power or status he had. He's always talking, isn't he, about the past when he was some big man in theory, when he was hanging out with McGregor in the West End, at the racetrack, at work, when he was the patriarch of the family, but he was in charge and he's no longer in charge. So he's certainly angry about that, bitter about that.
Absolutely.
He's got a pretty interesting view of his past too, though, doesn't he, Matthew? It's kind of distorted and contradictory. He paints these pictures of the happy family, which sound far too good to be true. I mean, he has this really contradictory attitude about his wife, Jessie, who he says wasn't such a bad woman, though it made me sick just to look at her rotten, stinking face. And he calls her a slut and all the rest. What is all that about?
I mean, that's what is very difficult to understand about Max. I guess if you highlight those things that he said, then we only have one version of this brute. And yet there is a sort of massively romantic side to him. He's very keen to tell stories about how he looked after his children and his wife in the past. It's worth saying that his brother and two of his sons still live with him. He cooks for them, whether they like the food or not. He certainly cooks for them. There's a nurturing side to him. When the son that brings the wife home first appears, he goes to great lengths to say, I think you'll like my father.
Which is somewhat surprising given what we see.
Somewhat surprising. But the clues that his behavior is not always that extreme. And I think that what happens with abusers is that they get away with the abuse because the flip side of their behavior is often so wonderful, so nurturing, so grooming, so caring. There's nothing sadder, is there, than an abused child? Because every time the door opens, he hopes he's going to get the version of his parent that picks him up and cuddles him or gives him a present. So they're all caught in this kind of dance of abuse and need. The final line of the play is kiss me.
Yeah.
Suggests to me that that's a deep need. The final line of the first act, after he's abused Teddy's wife so brutally, is he says of Teddy, he still loves his father. There's a real kind of complex dance of abuse and acceptance of behavior in order to hope for those moments of affection and beauty that familial relationships can provide uniquely.
That's really interesting about the cycle of abuse. The anger he feels, the only language he knows is to hit out, but the anger and need is a source of it. There may be some suggestion, isn't there, that Jesse, well, of course, Sam says that Mac had Jesse in the back of the cab, that Jesse was unfaithful or may even have been a whore of some kind that he's bitter about. Maybe that informs his anger and his view of women. And so maybe that's partly where his first reaction to Ruth appearing in the house, they assume she's a tart. Where does this come from? How does he jump to that assumption?
Well, I think it's both a sort of assumption in terms of his understanding of women and the behavior of his sons, in that it seems to me that it's no surprise to him that any of his boys might have access to sex workers.
Well, I guess if Lenny's a pimp.
Yeah. But I also think it's a provocation. I think he feels so let down by the absence of this son for 6 years that in feeling very hurt by that, he goes on the attack.
Yeah.
And his attack is something that we don't recognize as being legitimate. And it feels totally out of proportion.
But it comes from hurt.
I think so.
What about Ruth? Let's talk about Ruth. We talked earlier about we get signals from the start that all might not be well between her and Teddy. But what is striking also is how little she is cowed by any of the men and their aggression, particularly initially with Lenny. She is powerful and smart and seems able to stand up to them. Where does that come from, that confidence? What do we think her background is?
Well, it's interesting that you talk a little bit about her backstory, and where you've sort of started with is her immediate backstory, which is the last 6 years living as an academic's wife in an alien country in the States. We get in the body of the play, she takes us further back. She says that prior to that, her life was as a photographic model.
For the body.
For the body. And we've taken that, certainly Lisa, the actress, took that as a euphemism. And we also, through our research, found out that in Soho, in doorways, they would have postcards attached to the entrance that said photographic models upstairs. So it was a known euphemism. It was a code.
Yeah.
And I think in one of the earlier versions, Pinter might have suggested that she was a stripper or something, but certainly he coded her background a little bit more. Now, she then tells us about this place where she used to do her modeling, which was a house, and that the men that ran those sessions would get her drunk. We used to have a drink in the house, then we would go down to the lake and we would do our modeling there. And then she says, just before I went to America, I went back to that house. Now, why did she go back to that house? Pinter doesn't tell us, but we've decided that there was something about the behavior of those men that she felt strong enough through this new relationship with Teddy to go and take them on. Or perhaps that her first child was not Teddy's child. It was a child that had come about through a relationship with one of these men that she modeled for. And perhaps she wanted to give that guy a second chance. I mean, a lot of this is quite detailed backstory, but it's in order to answer your question. She knows who these men are. This is not the first time she's met brutes like this. This is not the first time she's met a group of men that just objectify and sexualize women. She knows how to deal with them, and you see it immediately with Lenny. She crushes Lenny.
Yes.
In 5 sentences after listening to him going on and on and on about how he abuses and treats women with physical violence. She just crushes him. She knows how to deal with these men. And I think from that point on in the play, she's figuring out how she can get the best deal out of this situation, which is the deal that she strikes at the end of the play.
This background you've sketched in supports the idea that the title is not just about Teddy coming home. It's Ruth also coming home.
Well, we decided, we tried to signify it certainly in the poster that it's her homecoming. It's very interesting. I think she has to come home to realize how unhappy she is in America. She's got that other brilliant speech. It's very short. After she asked them to observe her moving and observe her underwear, she says to us, and we don't know it up to that point, she said, I was born near here.
Yes.
And then 6 years ago, I moved to America. It's full of rocks and sand, and there's lots of insects there. And clearly she's disturbed. And I think she's needed to come home to realize how unhappy she is and how disturbed she is by the life she's being asked to live in America.
Yeah. So she returns literally to where she was born and to the life she may have been living before.
And now she's armed with experience. Look, again, in terms of the symbolism, I don't know whether this is true or not. Some people that we work with on the play and some observers think, she's got 3 children. And when she strikes her final deal, the only question she asks is, how many rooms will this flat have? And he says, not many. And she said, I'll need at least 3 rooms. Now, look, maybe that's an incredibly positive spin on it, that stage 1 is get a place and stage 2 is get my kids back.
Wow, I've never thought of that. That's brilliant.
That's available to you as a choice.
I wondered at that speech, which is vivid and poetic, of her memory of that big house in the country where she goes for the photographic shoot, whether that's a happy moment for her in the past or not. And I wondered whether it was at least a life where she felt, or not, maybe this is the opposite of this, where she had an independence.
She had an independence, but perhaps at a cost.
Yes, exactly.
But who are we? A lot of work is done to legitimize and protect and understand the choices that sex workers make now. And if she was a sex worker, there may have been a whole body of reasons why she made those choices. And there may be a whole number of things that she got from that negotiation with the world that is none of our business.
Well, it's a complicated one when you go into the legitimacy or not, or the agency in being a sex worker.
Yeah.
Which is part of what's the complication of this play.
Yeah. And I don't have any particular view on that. I'm just aware that a lot of people do, and a lot of sex workers do.
Yeah. So this is the journey that Ruth goes on through the play. And part of the catalyst is the encounter with Lenny. They are matched up against each other, as you described from the very start, when he makes a move on her out of the blue, asking to hold her hand, which is also a surprising moment. But she squares up to him. And as you say, she understands this language and it's deeply sexual from the start. Then there's the most extraordinary charged moment where Teddy has seen what's been going on and is getting spooked, I think, and thinks we got to get out of here, and says to Ruth, we're going home, cutting short the stay. And he's packed the cases and is standing ready to leave, holding her coat even. And Lenny asks Ruth to dance, and they do, and then kiss, with Teddy and the others watching. That's an electrifying moment, isn't it? Where the thing turns.
Yeah, it's very interesting as well, isn't it? That when Lenny asks for things at the beginning, can I hold your hand? She says, why?
Yeah.
It became very important to us, and certainly very important to Lisa playing Ruth, that the stage direction when she's dancing with Lenny is not he kisses her, it's that they kiss. So that she worked very hard in rehearsals for that to be something that Ruth made happen as much as Lenny.
Yes.
That there was a kind of desire there.
It's got to be as much her decision, if not more, at that point, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think then what's interesting is Pinter doesn't let us off the hook. So then another brother comes in and he forces something on her. She deals with that kind of brilliantly. She takes the danger out of it by not allowing Joey to be a sexual human being. She turns him into a child. She strokes his hair and shushes him. And it kind of, I don't want to say emasculates him, it kind of infantilizes him.
Definitely. Well, he's almost like a man-child anyway, isn't he?
So I repeat that she's sort of armed to deal with these men. And I am not for 1 second saying that these situations are easy for anyone, Ruth or any woman, to deal with. But she does, in front of us, she does deal with these men and manages to take the heat and the danger out of some of these horrible situations. There's something as well to be said about the whole voyeuristic nature of the sex in the play. Lenny never, ever talks about having sex. Women offer it him. He responds by being violent towards them. He gets Joey to tell a story about Joey's sexual conquest, where we know Lenny is watching. Lenny allows Joey to take Ruth upstairs, assuming that there will be sexual activity between them. The final line of the play is, the final stage direction of the play is, Lenny watches. So there's a lot to be said, or suppose that there's a kind of impotence about Lenny and a total fear around women and sex that means he only has a combination of violence and charm to negotiate with them. because he's not capable of any kind of physical relationship with them. And I think that in the same way we go, why is Max's behavior so extraordinary? If he's a kind of failed, dead lover, and it's something that Lenny's never been able to fully realize, again, we start to understand the violence of his misogyny.
That's a really great point about Lenny. You're right about the ending with that image as he is standing apart and not part of that scene where she is embracing Joey and seemingly available, but he seems to be cut off in a way, possibly by her, but also by himself.
I think it's by himself.
That fear and impotence is spot on. There's an insecurity which eats at him because he can't sleep, right? He's an insomniac. He's really tightly wound.
Yeah.
And he's full of all this menace and bravado and on a short fuse. It's also, here's a question, Matthew. It's also very funny. How does this happen? Because particularly Lenny, and in Joe Cole's performance, which is wonderful, restless, physical, at times he talks and talks and talks like he's on speed or something. And then when he's quiet and still, you fear what he's thinking, what may come next with all this coiled energy. But so physically expressive. And his language is a treat as well, isn't it? It's incongruously articulate, which comes back to this question of the mix of realism and not. Because it paints these vivid images, even with these disgusting stories. The images are fabulous. When he talks about going and shoveling snow, for example, in the early morning. And then he has this classic argument with Teddy where he's winding him up about philosophy. And he says to him, I want to ask you something. Do you detect a certain logical incoherence in the central affirmations of Christian theism? It's very, very funny. And yet, here's the question. How is it that we're laughing at what is a lot of the times grotesque behavior?
Well, I think that's about the skill of the playwright. And I think it's probably a tactic, an aim of the playwright. I mean, as you said in the introduction, I've spent a lot of time directing Martin McDonagh's plays.
Yeah.
And I guess what I constantly say about Martin's work is why can't we go towards these incredible, difficult subjects like women being kidnapped and potentially sexually abused, slavery, the horrific actions in the Congo. Why can't we be led towards these horrific situations and be dared by the playwright to explore that territory through humor? Why? Why not? Because the moralist, having our hand held by moralist playwrights and being taken towards these subjects in other ways isn't successful, as in these things still go on. And I'm not saying that treating these subjects with levity is going to change the world, but I don't think it's any less profound to explore these difficult subjects through humor.
I'm just trying to think this through. I had made notes about the similarity to McDonagh. And when we talked about The Pillowman, these very questions came up about how do we reconcile this mix of this comedy with what we're seeing? How are we given permission to laugh at these subjects? What is happening that we're accepting that we are capable of this violence? We could sit in denial if it's thrust in our face in a serious way. Because we all know that it's there, right? We can't just sit back like the middle-class educated audience and go, we don't have any of these feelings.
I think states that people find themselves in can be funny. So watching somebody just frustrated through impotence is very, very funny. So many sitcoms are built around that kind of frustrated tyrant. So the state that somebody's in can often be very funny. I think Pinter is very good using his brutes and their frustration with the world. He understands that tickles us somehow.
I was tickled so much by the language. I come back to that. I was saying about Lenny's language in particular. There's just a joy in it, and the precision is wonderful. You detect at the very beginning, there's the content of this play. And actually, my wife said to me after the show that I was laughing quite a lot. But part of me is laughing because of the appreciation of what he's doing.
Yeah, it's bravura writing. We're aware of the sort of intellectual athleticism, and it's scintillating.
Absolutely scintillating. I can't resist quoting another one. When Lenny and Ruth have this dialogue about clothes, and it's, again, there's a great sexual undertone going on. And he talks about a hat he once bought for a girl with a bunch of daffodils a black satin bow, and then it was covered with a cloche of black veiling. A cloche, I'm telling you. I mean, you just have to laugh at the word cloche, don't you?
You do, but also it's interesting that you said there's a kind of sexual undertow to that scene. I think he's doing everything to avoid the sexuality of the scenario. She leads everything. She says, I was a model. And he says, hats.
Yes, that's a deflection.
That's a deflection. And she says, no, I was a model for the body, a photographic model for the body. Indoor work, he says. She's forcing the issue sexually.
Yeah, interesting.
And it's interesting that he's not interested in making the situation sexual until his brother is present. His brother has to come into the room with a coat before Lenny goes, okay, we'll play the sex game.
Well, is it all about showing off? It's all about being not found out as well. I mean, it's interesting that insecurity you touched on earlier. I guess it plays out a little bit in the way they treat Sam as well, who we haven't talked about much, but he's almost like a fish out of water in these macho waters, in a sense. You know, he's relentlessly abused by Max. And in fact, specifically, I think he tries to suggest that he's homosexual, doesn't he? Anyone could have you. You'd bend over for $50 on Blackfriars Bridge.
There's a lot of insinuation from Max about Sam's sexuality.
He's not married at 63 and there's no prospect. He keeps teasing him and taunting him about that.
Yeah. And yet there's something romantic about Sam's recollection of his relationship with Max's wife, Jessie. There's a real complexity there.
Yes.
It's interesting how we want to sort of make decisions about characters from the outside. So a lot of people have said on viewing it, about Sam, the gay brother. We never made that decision internally. We felt there was something about his unrequited relationship with Jessie that was potentially really deep and really painful.
He definitely holds a candle for her. He's driven her around, looked after her. He says, I looked after her for you when you weren't here, Max. And then he's especially bitter and hurt by the fact that McGregor had her.
Yeah.
Bespoiled her somehow. And maybe he's just, I don't know, angry at his own impotence in not.
I don't know. I think he just felt like perhaps something, even if it was only a version of Jessie that existed in his own head, that something had been spoiled.
Yeah.
For him. I'm not going to make any moral decisions about what Jessie did or what Mac did. We don't meet those characters, so we don't know. But from Sam's perspective, something has been spoiled. Just something about the richness of the symbolism. I'd not seen the play for 3 weeks, and I went to see it on Monday. That's a long time for me not to see a show. And I'd never understood what these apples were about. Again, when I talk about it being crystallized, and we'd chosen to have an overflowing bunch of apples. What are these apples about?
So Sam picks one up and starts eating an apple, and it's so out of place.
As soon as he bites it, he talks about Jessie. As soon as he tastes something pure, he talks about Jessie. So that's the only time that Pinter talks about the apples. And then later on, I got him to bite the apple again, just for some stage action. And I was watching it on Monday and I went, oh, he immediately talks about Jessie then. So we absolutely stumbled into that. And I had not realized that the 2 times he bites the apples, he talks about Jessie until I watched the play on Monday. And I suddenly understood what those apples might mean.
It's interesting. He's also taunted about his job and everything, but at least he gets some respect at work. The customers like him. He's courteous. And I guess there was some gallantry about his relationship with Jessie. So he's a very attractive character in a lot of ways. And in fact, of course, he says to Teddy at one point, you were always my favorite, because in some ways they share a sensitivity, do they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, lots of people who come to this play think that Teddy might be Sam's son, that he did have a relationship. Because what he does is he makes them a familial triangle. He says, you were always my favorite of the boys. Thank you for writing to me. That really moved me. So he creates this kind of bond. He leaves out Max. He pushes Max away by saying, I never told your father that you wrote to me. He really recruits Teddy in a sort of familial way. And then he turns it into a familial triangle by saying, basically, not only were you my favorite, you were also your mother's favorite.
Right. Well, there's also, isn't there some other suggestion maybe that one of the boys may be McGregor's son.
Well, we cast it like that. I mean, I was lucky, but I also had one eye on it that if you look at the colouring of Jared, Joe, and Bobby, who plays Teddy, they're all sort of strawberry blondes. And then we cast this sort of dark, brooding McGregor, essentially, as Joey. So
That's a detail I didn't catch.
I lent into that.
Brilliant. Matthew, I'm conscious of time. Shall we get to the ending?
Yeah, why not?
And this comes back to the nub of the question about Ruth's behavior. Although Ruth appears to accept the terms that the men propose to become a prostitute, again, question mark, as well as their domestic and sex slave, Max expresses some doubt about whether she will actually do as they want. He raises the question, is there some way that Ruth is using them rather than the other way around? And you talked about her, she negotiates the terms of the arrangement, 3 rooms in the apartment. You mentioned a personal maid, and she sits in Max's chair, which is clearly a threat to Max. So, there's some idea she's in charge, but in charge of what? Michael Billington said the play is a story of Ruth's triumph and ultimate empowerment. But can her compliance with these grotesque plans really be interpreted as an act of female agency and victory?
Well, it's interesting that you use the word grotesque. They are grotesque. Are they grotesque? They feel grotesque because we see them cooked up by men in her absence, their version of it. As soon as it's presented to her, she changes the terms of the proposal and seems to hammer out a deal that she finds acceptable. No one explicitly uses the word sex work or prostitution, but she's not an idiot. She knows what they're talking about. And as we have said before, perhaps she's been in this territory before. But the play ends with a character saying, she's not going to do what we asked her to do. That's the ending of the play. So I wouldn't make the same claim as Billington. But what I'm saying is we've seen her do nothing other than understand how to deal with these men. So there's every suggestion to me that what we don't see the following day, the following week, the following year, that skill in dealing with who they are doesn't continue. And you can argue that one man is going, I can see what this is. She's sat in my throne and this is going to continue. And the other man who has great power, Lenny, observing her from a distance and probably asking the same set of questions, perhaps.
She has abandoned her children, and the terms that she is, in a sense, negotiating under, she's colluding with those terms at the very least. But whether she literally complies is in doubt.
Well, okay, she's abandoned her, but she's also rejected a life where she is nothing other than an academic's wife. What does he offer her? Well, the last thing he says to her before we see her starting to make real moves to offer Lenny something when she kisses Lenny, pretty much the last thing that Teddy says to her before that is, you can help me write my essays. I'd like that. What sort of offer's that?
Yeah.
What is she being offered? I think we get a sense that her life in America is a trap. Again, in terms of the gap between our audience, certainly the people that do what we are doing and talk about these plays, the notion that someone might go, that academic life offers me nothing. But actually, this life on the street, I experience vitality.
I think we can imagine an arid hell.
Yeah.
Stuck in academic world.
Yeah. Lisa kept saying to me, she's coming back to life. She's coming back to life.
Yes.
And that was a very interesting set of choices that Lisa wanted to make in the playing of that part and finding agency for that woman.
So it's that the homecoming is coming back to life as well.
Perhaps.
Going back to the similarity with McDonough, do we assume that Pinter does not condone the misogyny demonstrated by the men? He accepts it as a reality. Whether he believes that Ruth carries on, perhaps it's not even meant to be taken literally. But ultimately, it just throws into relief the kinds of behaviors that he wants to expose. We are to make that judgment on those behaviors.
I think so. I often think that, ultimately, all Pinter's observations are political. He's brilliant. And if people have not watched it, his brilliant acceptance speech of the Nobel Prize, which just turns into 15 minutes of destruction of US foreign policy. I think he puts those situations in his early plays in a microcosm of the domestic situation. And the brutality of Max is the brutality of the state. And within that, there are people who are oppressed and have to constantly fight for the best deal that they can get from the oppressor.
Like women.
Like women. I mean, look, I'm not here to be, and I know you're not asking me to do this, I'm not here to be an apologist for the play. And all the questions that people might ask of the play, we asked every day that we were making it, and we are still asking them now. And we didn't make any decisions to justify the brutality. We just didn't want to make any decisions that hid the brutality of the play. Our response to it as an audience member, it has to be in the eye of the beholder. I just want to present the play as clearly as possible in order that every response is available to each audience member.
I think this conversation, you've given a huge amount of food for thought and how we can come back to this play. I read that Pinter talked about ambiguity as being an important element of what he was doing. And there's certainly ambiguity here because it's part of life, ambiguity. Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I feel honored to have had the chance to talk with you about this play because you obviously understand it very deeply. Before I let you go, Matthew, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might do on the podcast or one that's just a personal favorite. Now, I know this is an iniquitous question to ask you as a director. Maybe it's the next thing you're doing.
No, it's not. But I mean, I came up with the answer immediately. The play that I would encourage people to explore is a play by Martin Crimp called Attempts on Her Life. I think in terms of a whole generation of playwrights, both in terms of Crimp's peers and the people that have followed him, a bit like Pinter and Carol Churchill, it changed the way certainly British playwrights at the Royal Court School, etc., started to write plays.
When was it written?
I think it was written in the mid-90s as part of that extraordinary movement when there was Joe Penhall and Martin McDonough and Sarah Kane. It was done upstairs at the Royal Court. It's a kind of cult classic. And then it was revived in the noughties by Katie Mitchell at the Littleton, at the National. And it's essentially 14 scenes, all about a woman called Anne. But every single scene is different formally, is set in a different place and time. Again, the title is brilliant, Attempts on Her Life. It's like through these different dramaturgical attempts, a full life is built. It's absolutely brilliant.
That's a great recommendation. Sounds structurally very interesting as well. Thank you, Matthew. Matthew's scintillating production of The Homecoming continues at the Young Vic Theatre until the 27th of January 2024. After what you've heard today, please go and see it and make up your own mind.
Thank you, Douglas.
As the curtain falls on Ruth sitting impassively on Max's chair, with the men clustered at her feet in waiting, do we celebrate her new position as a female victory against the misogyny shamelessly displayed by the men? Or has she succumbed to their degrading terms? Surely, one way or the other, it is a warning against such brute attitudes and behavior. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.